the family friend. It all began so innocently, as these things often do. Isabel had known Mark for years. He was practically family. Their friendship with him stretched back over a decade. He and Isabel's husband, David, had gone to college together, and the bond they'd forged during their wild, youthful days only grew stronger as they settled into the comfortable rhythm of adulthood. Mark was always there, at birthday parties, holidays, and those long summer weekends spent by the lake. A constant presence, the kind of family friend you trust without question, someone you'd never look twice at because he'd been part of your life for so long that you stopped seeing him as anything but an extension of your home. At least, that's how it used to be. Isabel had turned 38 last fall. A mother of 2 teenagers, she had settled into her role as the glue of the household. She managed the day-to-day chaos with grace, always smiling, always putting everyone else first. Her laugh was infectious, her brown eyes warm and inviting, and her curvy frame wrapped in effortless elegance. She wore simple cotton dresses that hugged her figure just right, never intentionally provocative, but Mark had started noticing those soft curves in a way he hadn't before. It had been a long, cold winter that year. David's work trips were becoming more frequent, and Isabel found herself alone in the house more often. The silence of an empty home can be deafening after a while, the echoes of family life replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the soft tap of rain on the windows. That's when Mark started stopping by more often. At first, it was harmless. He would drop in to check on her, making sure she was doing all right while David was away. Sometimes he would bring groceries or help with a leaky faucet. Other times, they would simply share a cup of coffee, talking about life and laughing over old memories. There was comfort in Mark's presence, a familiarity that felt safe, but something was shifting, something Isabel couldn't quite put her finger on. It happened slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it. The first time was on a particularly chilly evening in March. They had been watching a movie together, one of those old romantic comedies that Isabel loved, but David couldn't stand. They were sitting on the couch, the fire crackling softly in the background. Isabel had tucked her feet beneath her, leaning into the warmth of the room, when Mark's hand brushed against her knee. It wasn't intentional, not really, but the touch lingered just a little too long. It sent a shockwave through Isabel, jolting her in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She didn't pull away, neither did he. From that night on, there was an unspoken tension between them. Every time Mark visited, there was a new awareness, an electricity in the air that neither of them addressed. They continued to pretend everything was normal, but beneath the surface, their friendly banter had become a dangerous game. Isabel knew she was treading on thin ice. She had always prided herself on her loyalty, her love for David and their family. But David's long absences had created a void she hadn't even realized was there. And Mark, handsome, familiar, and available, had started filling it. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though that was undeniable. There was something else, something deeper that drew Isabel to Mark. He understood her in a way David never could, at least not anymore. The long talks, the shared memories, the way he looked at her with an intensity that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. But it was still innocent. They hadn't crossed any lines, yet. Then came the night that changed everything. David had been gone for nearly a week on a business trip, and Isabel found herself restless. She tried to distract herself with the usual household tasks, laundry, cleaning, planning the kids' school schedules, but nothing seemed to hold her focus. When Mark texted, asking if she wanted to grab a drink, Isabel hesitated for only a moment. It was just a drink. They had done it 100 times before. Nothing had to change. But when she met him at the bar down the street, the atmosphere between them was different. The casual laughter felt too loud, the way his eyes lingered on her lips too long, the brush of his hand on her arm too intimate. By the time they got back to her house, Isabel's pulse was racing. She knew, deep down, that if she let him walk through that front door, things would never be the same. But when Mark stepped closer, his fingers grazing hers as he gently took the keys from her hand to unlock the door, Isabel didn't stop him. They stepped into the house, and for a brief, dizzying moment, everything felt like it always had, comfortable, safe, familiar. But nothing was the same anymore. Not after that kiss. It happened in an instant. One moment they were standing in the foyer, and the next, Mark was pulling her towards him, his lips crashing against hers. The kiss was intense, filled with years of unspoken desire and suppressed feelings. It was as if every moment they had shared had been leading to this. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest, her body betraying her better judgment. She should stop this. She had to stop this. But she didn't. Instead, she kissed him back. After that first kiss, Isabel couldn't stop thinking about Mark. The guilt hit her immediately after he left that night, but it was tangled with an undeniable exhilaration she hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, she knew that, but the spark between them had ignited something deep inside her, something she hadn't realized was missing. The next morning, as she stood in the kitchen making breakfast for her kids, the memory of Mark's lips still lingered on hers. She tried to focus on her routine, but everything felt different now. The way her body responded to the thought of him, the flutter in her stomach when her phone chimed with his messages, the ache in her chest that made her wish she could see him again. But it was impossible. Not with the kids around. Not with David coming home in 2 days. Isabel told herself it was just a moment of weakness, something she could forget, something she had to forget. But when Mark texted her that afternoon, "Had a great time last night? Can't stop thinking about you," her heart raced in a way that made her feel both ashamed and alive. She didn't respond at first. She couldn't. What could she possibly say? But the longer she stared at the message, the more she realized that she couldn't leave things hanging in the air between them. She needed to address it, to put it behind them somehow. But when she finally texted him back, her words betrayed her. "Me too," she typed, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. 2 days later, David returned from his trip. His usual cheerful self, he greeted her with a tired hug, oblivious to the storm swirling inside Isabel. As they sat down for dinner as a family, she could feel the weight of what had happened with Mark pressing down on her, like a secret she had to carry alone. David was talking about his meetings, the projects he'd been working on, and all the while, Isabel found herself zoning out, replaying that night over and over in her head. She wanted to be here, present, engaged, but her mind kept drifting back to Mark. The guilt was unbearable. The days passed, and Isabel forced herself to act as if nothing had changed. She kept her distance from Mark, declining his offers to visit or grab a coffee. But the tension was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. Then came the birthday card. It was a Saturday morning, just a regular weekend day, and Isabel was organizing the clutter that had accumulated over the past few months. She sorted through old papers, discarded junk mail, and stumbled upon a small stack of birthday cards from earlier in the year. One card stood out. Mark's. David had been in the garage working on his car, when Isabel, deep in her organizing, hadn't even noticed him come inside. She had opened the card and was rereading Mark's handwritten note. What she had once thought of as sweet and thoughtful, now felt heavy with the weight of everything they'd shared. The note wasn't just kind, it was too affectionate, too familiar. Just as she was about to slip the card back into its envelope, David's voice broke through her thoughts. "What's that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Isabel's heart skipped a beat as she quickly closed the card, trying to act casual. "Oh, just some old birthday cards. I was clearing out the junk drawer." David raised an eyebrow, sensing her discomfort. "That's Mark's card, isn't it?" Isabel nodded, her throat tightening as she handed it over. David's expression was unreadable as he scanned the message. It was filled with the usual birthday well wishes, but there was a line near the bottom that caught his attention. "I don't know what I'd do without you in my life. You've always been there for me, in ways no one else has. I hope this year brings us even closer." David looked up from the card, his blue eyes clouded with confusion. What does he mean by closer? Isabel's pulse quickened, a wave of heat rushing through her body. She had no good answer, at least not one that would make sense in this moment. "It's just Mark being Mark," she said with a forced smile. "You know how he is, always a bit overly sentimental." David's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long before he shrugged and placed the card on the counter. "Yeah, I guess." But Isabel could see the shadow of doubt beginning to form in his mind. She could feel it. The suspicion was there, faint but growing, like a crack in the foundation of their marriage. Days turned into weeks, and Isabel's life became a delicate balancing act of pretending everything was normal, while suppressing the growing tension between her and Mark. They hadn't spoken much since that night, but every time she saw him at a family gathering or when he stopped by the house, the air between them was thick with unspoken desire. One evening, with David out of town again and the kids at a friend's house, Mark showed up at Isabel's door, unannounced. She knew she shouldn't let him in, knew that whatever unresolved feelings lingered between them would only spiral out of control, but the pull was too strong. He stepped inside, and as soon as the door closed, the pretense of friendship crumbled. Their lips found each other again, more desperate this time, the heat between them undeniable. Isabel's body trembled as Mark's hands roamed her curves, the familiar warmth of him igniting something reckless in her. She knew what they were doing was wrong, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. As the weeks passed, Isabel's life began to unravel in slow motion. What had once been an innocent friendship had now twisted into a full-blown affair. Every time David left town, Mark was there, slipping into the role of more than just a family friend. Their secret meetings became more frequent, more dangerous, yet each stolen moment felt like a lifeline that Isabel couldn't let go of. At first, they were careful. The clandestine nature of their encounters made everything feel thrilling, like a game they were both too invested in to stop playing. They'd meet in the late afternoons, when the kids were out with friends or at school, making sure to erase any trace of their rendezvous before David came home. The comfort of her familiar home had now transformed into something else entirely. The place where she once felt safe now held layers of guilt, hidden under every touch, every glance exchanged with Mark. But it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. Isabel found herself growing more paranoid, jumping at every text message or unexpected phone call. The thrill of the affair had come with a price, the constant fear of being discovered. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, anyone, could catch on to what they were doing. Every family gathering became a minefield of tension, where even the most innocent interactions between her and Mark felt scrutinized under a magnifying glass. At one such gathering, it almost came to a head. It was David's birthday, and they had invited a small group of close friends over to celebrate. Mark was, of course, among the guests, and from the moment he arrived, Isabel could feel his eyes on her. She wore a light blue dress that day, simple, elegant, but the way it clung to her curves made Mark's glances more intense, more charged. Isabel tried to play it cool, laughing along with the group, and pretending that nothing had changed between them. But every time Mark brushed past her, the heat of his presence made her pulse race. David, ever the gracious host, was mingling with their guests, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But Isabel knew she was playing with fire. The more she and Mark exchanged these secret looks, the harder it became to maintain the illusion of normalcy. At one point during the evening, Isabel found herself in the kitchen alone, preparing drinks for the group. Mark slipped in quietly behind her, his presence so familiar now that she didn't even need to turn around to know it was him. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered, his voice low, his breath warm against her ear. Isabel's heart skipped a beat, her hands shaking slightly as she poured the wine. She glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was watching, before she whispered back, "We can't keep doing this. Someone's going to notice." Mark stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against the small of her back. "No one's noticed anything," he murmured, his lips dangerously close to the curve of her neck. "Besides, you want this as much as I do." She did. God, she did. But the walls of the house felt like they were closing in on her, the guilt gnawing at her every time she looked at David, who remained blissfully ignorant. Just then, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Isabel's heart leapt into her throat. It was one of their friends, Lisa, coming in to grab more ice. She didn't seem to notice the tension between Isabel and Mark, but Isabel could feel her own face flush with guilt. For the rest of the evening, Isabel kept her distance from Mark, terrified that they were too close to being caught. She threw herself into playing the perfect hostess, laughing at David's jokes, smiling at their friends, and pretending everything was perfectly fine. But inside, she felt like she was teetering on the edge of a cliff, one wrong move away from a complete disaster. A few days later, the card incident came back to haunt her. David had been distant since finding Mark's overly affectionate birthday note, though he hadn't mentioned it again. But Isabel could tell something was off. He was quieter, more distracted, as if the seed of doubt had taken root in his mind. One evening, after dinner, David brought it up. "I've been thinking about that card from Mark," he said, his tone casual, but with an edge that Isabel hadn't heard before. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What about it?" David shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "I don't know. It just seemed a little off. Like maybe there's something I'm missing." Isabel's stomach twisted into knots. She forced a laugh, trying to sound dismissive. "David, you're overthinking it. Mark's always been overly sentimental." David finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, maybe. But I can't shake the feeling that there's something else going on." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with suspicion. Isabel's pulse quickened, her mind racing. Was this it? Was this the moment where everything unraveled? She tried to maintain her composure, but the guilt was starting to suffocate her. "You're being paranoid, David. Mark's our friend. He's been around for years. There's nothing going on." David didn't respond immediately, just studied her face for a long moment. Isabel could feel her hands trembling under the table, her heart hammering in her chest. "I hope you're right," he said finally, his voice low. "Because if there is something going on, I want to know about it. I deserve to know." That night, Isabel lay awake in bed long after David had fallen asleep, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew the clock was ticking. David's suspicion was growing, and sooner or later, he would find out the truth. She thought about ending it with Mark, about cutting ties and trying to salvage what was left of her marriage. But every time she considered it, the pull of what she had with Mark was too strong. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. With him, she wasn't just David's wife or a mother of two, she was Isabel, a woman who could still be desired, still be wanted. But was that worth risking everything for? As the days turned into weeks, Isabel could feel the walls closing in. David's suspicion hadn't disappeared, but he hadn't pushed her for more answers either. He was watching, though, observing her in a way he hadn't before. Isabel could sense it in the small things, the way his eyes lingered on her phone when a message came through, how he hesitated before leaving for work trips, his casual questions about her plans when he wasn't home. It was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth. Isabel knew that. And yet, every time she tried to distance herself from Mark, something pulled her back. Their chemistry, the history, the deep connection that had once been innocent, but was now tangled in lust and guilt. One afternoon, with David away on another work trip, Isabel found herself alone in the house. She had sworn to herself that she wouldn't see Mark again, that the last time really had been the last. But as she sat in the quiet of her living room, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, she saw his name flash across the screen. "Miss you." Her heart skipped a beat, her resolve crumbling faster than she cared to admit. She stared at the message for a long moment, biting her lip, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. "I shouldn't do this," she thought, but she was already typing a response. "Miss you too." Minutes later, Mark was at her door. They barely spoke as he stepped inside, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between them. The air crackled with tension, a mix of excitement and fear. Isabel knew this was wrong, but every nerve in her body hummed with anticipation. Without another word, Mark pulled her into his arms, their lips crashing together with a desperation that felt all too familiar now. The kiss was hot, fast, filled with the urgency of a passion that had been suppressed for far too long. Isabel's fingers tangled in his hair as he pressed her against the wall, his hands roaming her curves, exploring her body with the ease of someone who knew her well. But even as her body responded to him, a gnawing sense of dread clawed at her chest. The closer she got to Mark, the more she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between desire and destruction. The thought of David, of the life she was risking, flickered at the edges of her mind, but she couldn't stop herself. Not now. Not when Mark was right here, his touch erasing every rational thought she had. They tumbled onto the couch, their bodies entwined in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. Every touch felt dangerous, every kiss a reminder of how far they'd fallen. But for the brief moments they were together, all the guilt, all the fear, melted away. Nothing mattered except the heat between them, the overwhelming need to be close, to feel something. When it was over, The house was eerily silent. Mark lay beside her, his breathing steady, his arm draped lazily across her waist. Isabel stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The intimacy of the moment felt stolen, like a fragile bubble that could burst at any second. She glanced at the clock, her stomach twisting as reality began to set in. David would be home tomorrow. The kids would be back soon. Everything would go back to normal, or at least the version of normal they were pretending to have. But Isabel knew the truth. Nothing was normal anymore. The cracks in her marriage were widening, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore them, they were there, deep, irreversible. Mark stirred beside her, propping himself up on one elbow to look at her. His expression softened, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I should go," he said quietly, though his tone was filled with reluctance. Isabel nodded, though her heart clenched at the thought of him leaving. As wrong as it all was, there was a comfort in Mark's presence that she couldn't deny, but she also knew that the longer he stayed, the closer they came to disaster. She walked him to the door, the tension between them still thick, but softened by the shared intimacy of the afternoon. As he turned to leave, Mark hesitated, his gaze locking with hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Isabel forced a smile, though the weight of everything hung heavy on her shoulders. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'll be fine." But as she watched him drive away, the knot in her stomach tightened. How long could they keep this up? How long before everything came crashing down? The next morning, David returned home. Isabel tried to push the thoughts of Mark out of her mind, throwing herself into the mundane routine of family life. Breakfast, laundry, kids' schedules, it was all a blur of normalcy, a mask she wore to keep everything in place. But David's presence, his quiet suspicion, was always there, lurking in the background. He didn't bring up the card again. He didn't mention Mark. But Isabel could feel his watchful eyes on her, the unspoken tension between them growing with every passing day. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, after dinner, and the kids had already gone to bed. Isabel was sitting on the couch, reading, when her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at the screen, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Mark. Her instinct was to ignore it, to pretend the message didn't exist. But before she could stop herself, she opened it. "Can't stop thinking about you." The familiar thrill rushed through her. But just as quickly, guilt swelled up like a wave, crashing over her. She locked her phone, placing it face down on the table, but the damage was already done. And then, without warning, David's voice cut through the silence. "Who's that?" Isabel's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, her mind racing. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression hard to read. She swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's just a message from a friend." David's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "From Mark?" The room felt like it had shrunk, the air heavy with tension. Isabel's pulse quickened, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. And then, before she could respond, David's phone rang. He didn't answer it immediately, but when he glanced at the screen, his face paled. Isabel could see the name flashing across the phone's display. "Mark." David hesitated for a moment, then answered the call, his voice low and controlled. "Hey, man, what's going on?" Isabel's stomach twisted into knots, her entire body going cold, as she watched her husband's expression shift from confusion to something much darker. His face drained of color, his jaw tightening. He ended the call abruptly and turned to face her, his eyes full of betrayal and shock. "Mark just confessed everything to me." Isabel's breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to tilt, the weight of her actions crashing down on her all at once. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears as she stared at David, her mind racing to process what had just happened. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. And then, slowly, she looked over at Mark's message on her phone, still sitting on the table. The secret was out. There was no going back now. What would you do if someone close to your family crossed the line? Share your thoughts on how the wife should handle the situation in the comments.